Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as
having that kind of trauma around my Tourette's and my OCD and kind of thinking about those experiences made it harder to really open up about it in my adult life. So I kind of came to this realization, and I wouldn't say it was like an aha moment, but it was kind of this growing realization that it was becoming harder to not talk about it for me.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Hey, it's Ben. I swear these weeks go by so quickly. We're now at episode 13 of season 8. And I have to tell you, if you haven't heard the past few episodes yet, give them a listen, catch up on them. There's lots of good insights, and this episode is no different. There's a lot coming up to think about with our guest this week, Tara Lerman. Thank you so much, everyone, for the plethora of responses to the question we had from a parent last week, I think, about healthy hobbies for Tourette. In this case, for a young person, 9 years old or so. It was a question from a parent whose child was diagnosed and having trouble, and what maybe are some hobbies or activities that align well with the experience of Tourette syndrome. So that was a question, came in from a parent. I'll just read a few of the answers posted over at the Tourette's podcast discussion group, things the community posted. John L. Bean, hello John L., hope you're doing great. She mentions the pursuit of arts like music and dance. She says, quote, "Everyone is so different, so you just try stuff out and see. I usually don't tick much when I'm focused on video games, but I know for many, it increases ticks. We're all so different and unique." End quote. Peter Zhao, aka Fabulously Tourette, says, "I assume hobbies that can help the kid focus, like music, singing, dancing, martial arts, and sports. Some kids with TS may have hand-eye coordination issues, so not every sport is suitable. When I was 9, I enjoyed making model airplanes." End quote from Peter Zhao. Thank you, Peter, friend of the podcast and host of Fabulously Tourette Radio, which I just had the pleasure of being interviewed on by Peter. It was a lot of fun to talk Tourette syndrome with him, asking me the questions about it. I'll post that in the show notes with this episode at tourettespodcast.com. Peter, thank you so much. Shannon says, "Dance and music for my daughter." So dance and music are getting a popular showing in the responses so far to this question about hobbies or activities for a young person with Tourette, 9 years old or around that age. Mandy says, "Music, arts, crafts, drama, baking. My daughter is 12 and was diagnosed at 8. When she gets lost in her music or creating things, she is not ticking and has less anxiety." Thank you, Mandy. Chris says, "BMX, skateboarding, and instruments. Still doing BMX and music in my 50s, says Chris. Eric says, "Playing a musical instrument can help. Anything that your child puts their attention to and gets joy from. For me, my guitar calms me." Jan says, "Swimming, extremely helpful for tics, extra energy, etc." I'm seeing more than one person saying climbing, like rock climbing. Julianne says here, "My daughter recently discovered climbing. She joined a team. She absolutely loves it, and she doesn't tick when she's doing it." End quote. There are many answers to this question over at the Tourette's podcast discussion group, where I posted this question on behalf of a parent who reached out wondering about constructive or good activities in context with Tourette syndrome for a young person. One more, Penny Lane says, "My 9-year-old plays hockey in the winter and soccer in the summer. He's also very into Lego building or anything hands-on like Meccano or drawing. He also loves video games and coding." I love that about coding. There's another podcast I do at work, at my day job, and we did an episode a few years ago about kids and coding. That was really rewarding. Kids learning coding to not only cope with things they're going through in life, but also to get a life skill, a job skill out of it. Thanks to everybody who gave an answer to that question. I love the variety of answers. But I also love how you can kind of draw a line through a lot of the answers. Things involving physical activity or things involving creative pursuits seem to be really popular as answers. And our guest on this episode today is no stranger to that. This is an episode about a lot of things, but I love that one of the takeaways is the confidence and boost that you can get from hearing other people talk about their experiences with something that you've experienced in an isolating way, like Tourette. Number one kind of email this podcast gets, with people saying the conversations help them feel less isolated. Hearing things talk about things that are so seemingly rare, but so familiar. As we say, Tourette may not be a rare condition on its own, but the experience sure does feel isolating. It's also about reaching a point where you have something to say and you want to talk about it, and it's getting more difficult to not talk about it, as we heard our guest for this episode say in the intro up top. General question for the audience: how do you feel the neurodiversity conversation is going in the quote unquote outside world? Like, do you think people understand the concept to an encouraging degree? Is it making an impact in, say, the workplace in terms of acceptance and conversation? Or do you think the public is as confused as ever about these conditions and the headway we've made is minimal? Do you think neurodiversity is going to stick and grow as a conversation that we need to have? Or do you think it's just one of these things that happens to have some currency right now and we're fortunate to enjoy this conversation we're having, but will get replaced with another movement in a couple of years? Like, how do you think the conversation about neurodiversity is going? And is it sticking? Our guest on this episode, Tara, is a writer and a communicator professionally, and she has Tourette. And you'll hear as a theme through this episode is the fact that we seem to have made an impact indeed, but there's so much more to say. Like, how do we say it? Is it just repetition of the basics and hopefully things naturally build from there? Tara has heard from people in office settings wanting to talk more about neurodiversity, and Tara will send articles that she's written herself on the subject to say that human resources manager. And this episode is not really about that. It's not a clinic in how to write about Tourette or other conditions. It's definitely about the personal experiences of Tourette and what it means for our lives. But this is something we get into at one point in the conversation you're about to hear. Is just how to convey it. When do we convey it? What are the remaining challenges for communicating what Tourette is to the public? This kind of wraps back around to what we were saying about having something to say, a story to tell, and finding it more difficult as time goes by to not tell that story for the sake of the community, especially with something as personal as a neurological condition. This is a good and bright episode, thanks to our guest, Tara, who was really enjoyable to listen to, and we'll get to it right now.
So my name is Tara. I live in Washington, D.C., although I've been traveling a lot, so I'm not sure if I'm necessarily based here full-time, but been traveling a lot because I work remotely, and I work as a writer and editor. So I work for a media company where I manage branded content programs, lots of freelance writers, and do everything from video scripts to podcasts. And kind of the main thing that I do right now is branded content articles. So collaborating with different brands to tell stories about tech and sustainability and lots of different industries. So
that's pretty cool. That's sort of similar to what I do for a living, which I think I do credit Tourette for what I do for a living. It's creative services essentially. I'll do photography and videography and podcasting and kind of offer that as a package. And that's something I've always been interested in. How did you find your way into that line of work?
Yeah. So when I was younger, I actually struggled a lot in school and wasn't necessarily, really good at math or really good at science. And I think, looking back, I certainly didn't have the services that I needed to succeed. And test taking, I wasn't very good at test taking either. But one thing that I've always kind of been really good at is writing. And even from a young age, even when I struggled in, really every other subject, writing was always something that I, one, enjoyed, and two, just, knew I was good at. And yeah, ever since then, it just really became a nice creative outlet for me. So, I went to college and studied English, with kind of the idea that I wanted to go into journalism. Obviously, as I'm sure the media industry has changed a lot, really in the past 10 years. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot more with multimedia. There's a lot more with audio, and it's really exciting. And I like it because it's not, every day is really different. And I feel like I'm able to kind of jump from one thing to another, which I think is really nice because I get a bit bored with, doing the same thing every day. So I really enjoy it. But to your point about Tourette being really, something that is helpful in that regard, I think, and it took me a while to realize just the different ways that Tourette's has really helped me. I think I'm certainly more creative, more detail oriented because of it. I think
Yeah.
it certainly takes me longer to do different tasks, because of my Tourette's and because I'm, kind of ticking and coming back to things. But I think that has also made me more driven and made me kind of have this work ethic that I'm not sure I would have otherwise. And then, yeah, I think just curiosity. I think when I was diagnosed, and I was diagnosed when I was in third grade, so at a fairly young age, but I've been really, kind of research driven and really kind of curious about like, what is this? What do people know about it? How is the disorder really different from the stigma that people assign to it? And I think, that's been something that I've been doing a lot of, just kind of researching and being curious and talking to other people who have it. So certainly I think, that helps me with my job as a writer and editor, where you always have to be curious. You always have to be asking questions and, getting kind of the story. And so I think it's helped me. And I think it's not something I necessarily saw that way until recently.
That's interesting because your trajectory is really similar to mine. I was not good at science and math when I was a kid, even though I love science these days. I was not a science person when I was a kid. I was more of just a good speller, right. And, I could pick up art and things like that. But I think I had a pretty good idea early on that what I wanted to do was going to involve writing. Like, you got an English degree. Nice, I did the same thing. I went to school, got an English degree, wanted to go into journalism, which is what I did. So I was a reporter for a little more than a decade. And that's where I learned the skill sets, including podcasting, to be able to do Tourette's podcast. It was kind of interesting how I do think Tourette kind of informed, and for people who are confused as what we're talking about, I'm not 100% clear myself. I just know that I was really good at doing solo activities where I could kind of shine with a solo result, like a piece of written work, or just something creative that I produced. And I spent a lot of time by myself when I was a kid, and kind of honing my skills. And it's interesting how that sort of kind of became what I ended up doing for a living, is writing, and then kind of getting into complementary services like the photography and podcasting and things like that. The media, I say, like the media industry in quotes, just kind of ended up becoming this sort of mishmash of different ways to communicate.
Yeah.
So it's awesome that you're doing that. And you mentioned that you were diagnosed when you were pretty young, but you've kind of been connecting dots. Is that something that's been going on in the past few years, or is that something that's been kind of lifelong for you since you were diagnosed?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed. I think I was in third grade, and, really didn't know what Tourette's was. I had never heard of it. But I had this interesting experience where, I knew I had this condition, and I, at the same time, started hearing kind of like the mention of Tourette's in like the media and, in TV, and, these one-liners and in movies. And I was like, wait, like, that's what I have. I'm confused, and it just wasn't really something I talked about, to my friends, because I don't think I had the kind of, emotional growth, right? I was 10 years old or 9 years old, however old I was at that point. I think now I'm kind of getting to the point where I'm owning it, and I'm, talking about it, because talking about it is helping me really understand it. And so, of course I was bullied when I was in, fourth grade. There were two boys who would, just make fun of, I have an upper lip tic, and that's kind of the tic that is, has been most consistent throughout my entire life. And so that really started when I got diagnosed, or probably even before that. And so, they would kind of imitate me. I was called out in a music class, actually, which was, something I was good at. I was good at, singing. I did that kind of throughout my elementary school and middle school. But the teacher thought I was making noises on purpose. So she, kind of yelled at me in front of the 50 other kids. And I think like experiences like that almost made me ashamed of this. And, because kind of the external world was reacting in such a way that was like, not really supportive of this condition. And then I also had OCD, or I still have it, but I guess the severity has gone down. But I had very severe symptoms when I was in elementary school. And I think it was definitely hard for my parents because they weren't really sure what was going on. But, I would have to, turn lights on and off multiple times, close doors multiple times. Things had to be even. And I remember one day my mom was driving me to school, and I must have been in 5th grade at that point. And I had never been late for school. Like I was a pretty good student in terms of, showing up. And I had forgotten to, do some sort of routine that was part of my obsessive compulsive disorder. And I remember making my mom drive me back so that I could do it. And I think that was the point where she was like, okay, like we need to figure out kind of what this is. And yeah, so I think it was tough, just of course growing up, because also, neither of my parents had it. I don't think they knew much about it. And I think, to their credit, they did a lot to really make sure I was getting what I needed, and kind of learning with me along the way. And I'm the oldest of 3, so I have 2 younger siblings. So, for them too, that was kind of a confusing time. And, for a while they would kind of ask if I could stop making noises, stuff like that. And soon learned that I couldn't. And they've, they're super supportive, extremely respectful. But I think, it was definitely a hard time. And it was, and I think having that kind of trauma around my Tourette's and my OCD, and kind of thinking about those experiences made it harder to really open up about it in my adult life. So,
sure.
But yeah, I kind of came to this realization, and I wouldn't say it was like an aha moment, but it was kind of this growing realization that it was becoming harder to not talk about it for me than it was to just, open up about it. And I felt like because I wasn't talking about my Tourette's and my kind of, this thing that impacts me every second of every day, right? There were certain other things that I might have been holding back about to the people that were important to me. And I'll also say that this is not, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. Obviously, disclosure is so complex, and no one, everyone has like their own way of talking about Tourette's. And I also want to say that some people don't have the luxury of coming out about it because, maybe their tics are more noticeable, or, they have more difficulty suppressing it. So I certainly understand that that's also something that's really complex, and, there's no right way to do it. But yeah, I really kind of embarked on this Tourette's coming out tour, which is what I call it. And really, telling my friends, some colleagues as well, not doing it all at once. I think, really talking about it to the people that I at first knew would, really be supportive and ask questions and, ask how they could best support me. And one thing I realized through doing that is that when I was opening up about this part of my life, to the people I cared about, they were opening up more to me than they had before. So my former manager, actually, I spoke to her about it, and she opened up to me about actually having ADHD, which I don't know if she would have had I not said anything. So that was really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's important. That's definitely an important thing, is when you do let on vulnerabilities, people feel comfortable around you. And I've noticed that about myself since I came out about having Tourette syndrome. I've lived with it my whole life, but I've only been open about it in my adulthood for a handful of years. And but I've noticed that people have entrusted me with other things that they've been going through, because I think they know I have, some kind of, even if they don't understand it as, this is Tourette and this is what it is, they know I at least have some kind of frame of reference for, some kind of difficulty in life, or a diagnosis. It could just be as simple as that we have that in common. So it's been great that you've been opening up to people on your, you called it your coming out tour about your life with Tourette syndrome. But I mean, that there's a long period in there, right? Where if you were bullied for it, and I mean, did you have a conversation with yourself, so to speak, about maybe I should be closeted about having this? If you're seeing a world that doesn't necessarily understand it and certainly doesn't seem so supportive of it. And I'm talking about the world outside of your family who's trying to figure it out. I imagine there was a time where it was difficult to, or maybe did you do what I do or what I did when I was younger, where I decided I wasn't going to talk about it? I mean, was there a long period of time where that was the case?
Yeah. And I'm not sure if it was an intentional decision not to talk about it, but there was a shame around it for sure. And it got to the point where I mean, even if someone asked and, I remember being asked if, a common kind of question I get is, oh, do you have allergies? Are you chewing gum? Right. Because a lot of my tics are facial tics, or at least the noticeable ones are facial tics. And I would just lie. I would just say, oh yeah, I have allergies, or, oh yeah, no. Or I remember saying I would have this kind of like, oh yeah, it's a bad habit, which of course it's not bad and it's not just a habit. So, but that was kind of my line to avoid it. I didn't want to talk about it. I also think I was struggling a lot with the fact that when I did talk about it, my tics would get worse. And they still do, but I think I've kind of accepted that and separated this idea. I'm really trying to be intentional about separating the idea of, okay, do I not want to tick because it's really annoying to me? And some of my tics are very annoying and very tiring. Or is it that I don't want to tick because I don't want people to see me tick and think something about me? And so I have, it's interesting. I have a few other kind of tics that people wouldn't notice. So for example, I have like a neck jerk tic. That's actually pretty painful and probably not great for my back health, but no one really sees that one. And then the other one is just this like kind of complex mouth tic where, I've gotten like cuts on my mouth because of it. So I think it's interesting when we talk about like the severity of Tourette's, because of course it's a spectrum. But for me, I feel like some of my more severe tics are actually the less noticeable ones, which I think is kind of interesting. And I almost gaslit myself a little bit because, of course, you see people who have more noticeable tics, and you think like, oh, like maybe I shouldn't like be complaining, whatever. But
exactly,
yeah, like there are really painful tics, and they ebb and flow, and they're certainly stress induced and anxiety induced, and they're actually worse now than they ever have been, which is interesting because I think growing up, I remember people saying like, oh, it'll get better with age. It's actually gotten worse with age for me. And I wonder, certainly it kind of goes, it ebbs and flows, it comes and goes. But I also wonder if because I'm talking about it more, it's gotten more severe. So, but yeah, I think it's definitely been interesting to just like understand kind of how the tics manifest themselves, and just like being around people with Tourette, certainly makes me tic more. And I never, I never knew anyone growing up with Tourette. So it's really interesting just to kind of think about it as, the science of it and like what's happening and really like, yeah, what's happening to me in a body where my brain is not necessarily, responsible for some of these movements. And it's very interesting.
It's funny. You mentioned an upper lip tic, and that is kind of just the mention of that has revived sort of an upper lip tic with me just for the moment where I'm kind of touching it to my nose. And that's something I did a lot when I was a kid. And I find myself doing it again right now just from the mention of it, which I don't mind. But no apologies here. So in this time period, when you're younger and you're really trying to maybe at least get some sort of thinking handle on it, on what Tourette is and what it means for you and how it integrates into your life and how do people appreciate it and all that. I mean, had you talked to anybody else with Tourette syndrome at this point, or is this still pretty much you going solo?
Yeah, I had not talked to anyone about it. And I think partially, I think I really am not sure I wanted to at the time, or I wasn't ready. Because, when you're a kid, you're really, at least for me, I was so worried about what people thought. And I think the fact that I was bullied for my tics and people were noticing them without even me talking about it, I was I was really self-conscious. And I think it definitely impacted my confidence. I think I also, just in terms of school, like I was able to get extra time on tests, which was great. But then I think, other classmates would see that like I was one of the kids getting extra time. So, I was worried that they thought I wasn't smart. And for a while, I don't think I think I thought I wasn't smart because, especially with reading was something that, is this really interesting thing. I mean, I had kind of a, and I'm not sure how much of it was my OCD and how much was my Tourette's, and there's Tourettic OCD, and so I'm not sure, but I love to read, but it took me forever to read, and I was sounding things out, and I would get, I would kind of zone out and have to reread the page, and that still happens. Yep. But I think because of that, I was like, oh, I'm bad at reading, and they actually placed me in 6th grade. They placed me in kind of a, a reading class that was for people who kind of, needed kind of more help on reading. But, sure. But I wasn't able to take a foreign language because of that. And so it was this interesting thing. And now I've gotten to the point where I realize, slow reading does not make you a bad reader. And I actually would argue it makes you a better reader because you're really analyzing it. You're really like thinking about it. And, and, now I'm an editor. Now I read things for a living. So it's just interesting how that worked out. And I always tell kind of people, I don't know, I've told colleagues about it and stuff. And they're always very surprised. They're like, wait, you were in reading? Like, that's so interesting. So, I think there's kind of this idea that faster is better, especially in the context of growing up and standardized tests and all that stuff. But, now I do like reading. I just know it's going to take me longer.
That had a pretty big blow to my confidence when I was a kid, because I was a good speller. Yeah. I knew I could write well. And, but I remember reading was a task. And, I was on one level not interested because I wanted to do so many other things. But when I started reading, when I discovered certain authors, and I was like, oh, wow, okay, so this is really good reading. This is what I want. It was still a very slow process. Exactly what you were saying about, like, you would read a page, get to the end and be like, what did I just read? Yeah. And I have to go back and read again. And I was a very, very bad reader kind of starting out. But I mean, to your point about, you kind of slow down your experience with the book and you get to kind of spend more time with it. But it was definitely, I think, as I was thinking at the time, I was like, it just kind of felt like a confidence bust in a way where especially because I was just going to say, especially because reading is one of those things that people really bond over, right? Like when I was growing up, everyone was reading Harry Potter, and then, people were reading Twilight in middle school, and I just I couldn't keep up. And that's why, I still to this day have trouble with book clubs because I'm just slower, and I'm okay with that. Right. Yeah. But I think it is definitely like there's a social anxiety around it a little bit for me, because it is something that, it's almost like that people bond over music too. It's the same thing. People bond over books. So like, so that's been really interesting. And it's not something I necessarily, attributed to Tourette at the time. I was kind of just like, oh, this is something I'm not good at. So it's been really interesting kind of, realizing that, you can be slower at something and you can still be good at it. What did you find when you were younger that you did, we talked about writing and things like that, but I mean, were there creative outlets that you had access to when you were younger and you were trying to figure all this out?
Yeah. So it's interesting you mentioned, doing things alone, because I think that definitely resonates with me. I think I was not really big into team sports. But I did theater and I loved theater. I was like, not doing necessarily soccer or anything that normal kids were doing, but I did get into theater. I got into singing. That was, kind of the thing where I would do it and, I'd be so focused and so invested, and my tics would, I'm not sure if they disappeared altogether at the time, but they definitely, kind of lessened when I was doing things like that. Yeah, I would say writing. And to this day, when I'm writing and I really get into a flow, it's really incredible. But yeah, I think as an adult too, like I just like exploring, I've been exploring so many different things. I've gotten into rock climbing recently, hiking, ice skating, like all these, I just kind of want to try everything. And it comes back to that curiosity maybe a little bit, but yeah, I think as a kid, definitely writing, definitely theater, but yeah, I also spent a lot of time, it did take me longer to do things. So I remember like there were days where I would like just do homework and nothing else because it just took me so long. So it's funny when I talk to friends and, they talk about like, oh, I miss childhood. It was so easy. Like there were no cares. I was like, really? That was like one of the hardest parts of my life, So just because, I was dealing with all these things and I wasn't really sure what was going on. Now I have the language to talk about it that I don't necessarily think I had at the time. And also just this kind of understanding that, Tourette actually like is making me better at certain things. It's, giving me this growth edge I didn't necessarily have. So yeah, it's been interesting.
So when you say you've got the language to talk about it, is that something that you developed after really trying to take an interest in Tourette syndrome and yourself and where that fits with you? Or how did, and do you mean just ways of describing it to other people? Like, what do you mean by language?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of things. I think, one thing is just really reading up about it, reading the statistics, honestly hearing other people's stories. So, I listened to this podcast and just, kind of researched, stuff that the TAA and all these other organizations were doing. And hearing other people talk about their own experiences and, being like, wow, that actually happened to me too. And I didn't even think that this was a thing that like, had to do with Tourette, but like it does, you're talking about reading too. Like I didn't even, think Tourette's and reading like were, I really got to hear other people's stories. And I think hearing other people open up about it and, their own experiences made me more confident, more kind of excited almost to open up about my own.
That's cool.
And the nice thing is people, generally are pretty receptive. Of course, you have people who say things like, oh, like I didn't, you don't swear, like, or, are you sure? Like I had someone say once, are you sure that's what you have? Like, yes, I am.
Yeah. You do a good job hiding it, things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of people who say like, oh, you don't even look like you have it. Or like, I haven't noticed you had it. And, almost like and again, this is like very, it's totally innocent. It's not, I don't think there's anything behind it, but
right. They may think they're saying the right things.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. And I think, the thing about that is like, yeah, it might not be noticeable, one, because I'm probably suppressing it because I'm in public, but also, like I said, like there are tics going on kind of behind the scenes that people don't necessarily see, but are still, fairly painful and pretty tiring for me. So.
The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support for those with Tourette syndrome or a tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the Tourette community. To learn more, go to tourette.org. That's tourette.org. The Tourette Association of America. Uncontrollable, unstoppable. This is something, kind of getting into your more adulthood with Tourette syndrome, and you had mentioned your coming out tour and all that. So was this something that, nobody knew about you? Like, I mean, obviously your family did, but close friends? I mean, were you keeping it that closely guarded before you started to talk about it?
Yeah, I think I opened up to a few friends about it in college and then a few friends in high school. So
Yeah.
probably I would say in terms of friends, maybe 3 or 4 people knew about it. But, I had made so many other friends after college and, through work and stuff like that. And, none of them knew about it. None of my, extended family knew about it. And so I've kind of opened up about it in a few ways because, of course, I'm not going to have a conversation with like every single person in my life. And, that's too exhausting for me.
Yeah.
But what I have been doing is, obviously if it comes up in a conversation and, talking about it. And honestly, it's interesting. Like I would say 2 years ago, like I couldn't even say the word Tourette or Tourette's. Like I just could not say it. Like it would make me so uncomfortable. And I think it's because there was trauma associated with, right? Like I thought about like all these things that had happened to me growing up and like how upset I was and how hard of a time that was. And yeah, I ended up going to therapy because I had this kind of goal of, I want to be more open about it. And I want to be able to talk about it without, getting so emotional and getting upset. And like, yes, there is trauma associated with it, but it's also this part of my life that I want to be more open about, and really own,
Yeah.
and educate people, because I think one of the most frustrating parts for me growing up was the fact that no one either knew what it was or their idea of what it was informed by, the media and a lot of kind of false narratives around it. So, so one thing I've been doing is writing about it, because that's, as I mentioned before, something, I know I'm good at, and I also feel like it's the best way for me to be vulnerable. Like for whatever reason, I feel like I can be more vulnerable in my writing. And maybe it's because I don't see I'm not talking to a person. I'm just, writing on a screen, and someone will see it on their own time.
I feel the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's been really good. I think, even just little things like liking something on LinkedIn and, about like neurodiversity or about Tourette, maybe, sharing something on Instagram, like little things like that, where, I'll share something on my story or I'll share a personal experience, has been really helpful. So it's kind of like in these small, bite-sized pieces. It's not kind of all at once. It's, it's really kind of in the digital space. But then also, having these one-on-one conversations and not just talking about Tourette, but also my own experience with it and kind of how that's impacted me, because I think a lot of my friends didn't really know that side of me, especially even like my close friends from middle school and high school who I'm still friends with. Like they didn't know me in elementary school. Like they didn't know all these things that I dealt with. So it's like been really actually interesting and I think made us closer as friends, just to be like, this is what I went through, when I was in elementary school. And like, honestly, this is what I went through when knew me, but I didn't necessarily have the words to explain it, or was kind of ashamed about it. And that's the other thing. Yeah. I didn't tell my friends in, middle school and high school until later, because I was so, I wanted them to like me. I was like, oh, they're going to think I'm weird. They're going to like not want to be my friend anymore, which of course would not happen. But kids are mean, like you never know.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think I kind of like made up all these, I kind of like made up these narratives in my head, like, oh, well, this is going to happen if I do this. And that, that of course is anxiety. I have a lot of anxiety as well. But I think kind of talking to them about it now and sharing my writing. And I think like the writing stuff has been really, really nice for me, because, I get to do research. I get to kind of talk about my own experience, but then just educate people about what's going on and about Tourette. And, it's interesting because even, I'll watch movies that are like 2021 movies, and they'll still have these one-off jokes about Tourette. And it's just so interesting, because I think we've come so far in so many, parts of mental health and neurodiversity and all these things. And for some reason, Tourette and maybe a few other conditions are still, it's still okay to make fun of them. And it's just like,
Yeah.
I really, I get very frustrated when I see that, because, it just feels like we shouldn't be doing that in 2023.
Right. Yeah. And do you find yourself when you're writing, I mean, are these the kinds of topics that you end up picking up, and are you writing to an outside world when you write about Tourette syndrome?
Yeah. So I would say, this is not part of my 9 to 5 job. I do, I do kind of other types of writing for that, but this is stuff that maybe I will put on my Medium site, or I'll try to pitch it to a publication. I wrote one about neurodiversity in the workplace, because I think, there's so much going on with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's like so many companies are taking these great steps, but for whatever reason, I think neurodiversity sometimes, not everyone understands what it is. And, some people think like, oh, that's just, that's the autism spectrum.
It just means autism. I've heard people
Right.
say that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes. And so I wrote an article about, kind of the fact that it's not synonymous with autism. It's actually, this umbrella term and all these other conditions, and why saying that it's just autism is kind of harmful for all these other people who experience other things. Right. And so like, we're getting to a place where, we can talk about it. And that's like incredible, because I don't know if we were there 3 to 5 years ago, but at the same time, we need to be talking about it in a way that's inclusive to all these other conditions.
It is amazing how different things feel now at this immediate moment versus 3 to 5 years ago. And it's hard to say to what role certain social awakenings have maybe played a role in that,
Sure.
or just the pandemic and our time to kind of sit down and think and evaluate our own, humanity or whatever. But it does feel like in the past 3 to 5 years, say that there's been some advances when it comes to acceptance of Tourette syndrome. And yes, it is, or at least understanding of it. The piece that David Begnaud did on CBS News just recently, I think was one of the best I'd ever seen on Tourette syndrome. But it seems like there's a lot going on at once, and we're putting the information out there. I mean, you're writing your pieces and they're getting out there. It's you hope that it sticks with the audience. What kind of feedback do you get from when you do talk about or write about Tourette syndrome from people who may not be familiar with it? I mean, we kind of talked about that a little bit from people who, you just kind of disclose to, and they'll say things that, maybe aren't the right things to say. But what are the kinds of feedback you get from people? I mean, do people take a genuine sort of curious interest in what this is? Have you encountered that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest thing I've encountered is just a lot of people come to me and they say, wow, I didn't realize that. I didn't know that about Tourette's. I didn't know that 10 to 15% of people with Tourette's have coprolalia. I didn't know what coprolalia was. I didn't know that they are comorbidities like OCD and ADHD. I think, I have really supportive friends who have said, what can I do? Like, what can I do to educate people? How can I help? Right. So that's been really nice. One friend mentioned that she works in PR, and a lot of her clients are wanting to talk about neurodiversity, and these articles are giving her accurate language to kind of guide them through that. So that was really cool. And she was like, she texted me, she said, Tara, I really credit you with educating me on that, because otherwise, I would have been putting out false information. So that was really cool.
Nice.
Yeah. And I think, in general, people are really supportive. It's nice because, these articles live on my portfolio, my website. But also, if maybe I mention I have Tourette's and I don't want to get into all of it. I'll send someone, a link to an article. And I think that's the other thing too, because I can't be the person who's gonna educate everyone. And also, of course, my experience with Tourette is totally different than yours or than someone else's. And so I think that's the other thing, just because one person with it does not mean that's what everyone's experience is. So I think I try to do that in my articles too. And I say, this is my experience, but also like, here's the science, here are the facts, linking to places you can learn more. And that's really important as well.
What do you think is one of the hardest things to convey about Tourette syndrome to people who are not familiar?
That's a great question. I think just the fact that that there's a spectrum of, and I wouldn't even say a spectrum, I would say kind of like a diversity of experiences. And there are so many things that impact those experiences and, right? Like the fact that I'm a woman probably makes my experience different. The fact that, if someone has another disability, like that is going to impact their experience. So there's really like so many different ways to have this experience. And I think the other thing is just the tics and the Tourette that goes on behind the scenes. So what people don't see, right? Because people generally focus on what they do see.
Yeah.
And it's interesting still having those experiences just because, people really don't understand unless they know I have Tourette. So I think my biggest kind of challenge right now is when I'm in public places, but they're strangers. And so how they react to my tics. So I was at a coffee shop several months ago and, just working. I work remotely. So I enjoy going to coffee shops and seeing other people. But this man who was sitting near me kind of kept staring. He was definitely noticing my tics and eventually kind of just like huffed and puffed and like stormed off. And, part of me was like, yes, that like I was frustrated, but also, it's like, when do you disclose to a stranger that you have Tourette? And like, because also, part of me wanted to say something because like, then maybe he'll have an interaction with someone with Tourette and won't do that. Right. So I actually did, and this was like very outside my comfort zone, but, I took a trip to Seattle a few months ago and I was walking and, someone mentioned, they're like, that person behind us is making so many annoying noises. And I actually came up to them and I said, actually, I have Tourette's. And, then just walked away. And my friend was like, wow. And I was like, yeah, I can't believe I just said that. But like now they know, right? Like,
sure.
Yeah. So I think, and again, there are certainly times that I would not have had like the energy to do that. So I'm not saying that's something I do often, but I think, just the lack of awareness, right? Like you wouldn't storm off if you saw someone, I don't know, sitting in a wheelchair and like maybe taking up a little more space because they need it. Right. And of course that's totally different. That's, more of a visible disability, but I think just like still the lack of awareness or like the staring that happens. I think that's like the most frustrating part because it really, they don't know what I'm going through, but like this like constant staring or even like one-off comments or stuff like that, I think is hard to explain to people.
Well, yeah, that's a good point because Tourette is in this, and you mentioned it earlier with it, Tourette and a few other things being still on the market in terms of misunderstanding and making fun of it and things like that. And Tourette ends up being in this position to where, it's your health and it's your business and you don't have to tell anybody anything you don't want to tell people about your health. But at the same time, like it's in this position where education is really needed and people kind of seeing how it works in the real world. Instances of that are really needed. So it's weird. The community has this right to be quiet about itself and not have to say anything because we don't know anything to anybody. But at the same time, we do want to be vocal so more people can know what it is we go through so we can have a better future, or the people down the line who have Tourette syndrome so they can have a better reality. But it's interesting how, it's your health, it's your business. You don't have to say anything,
totally.
but there's something about this that kind of motivates you too.
Yeah. I think, and that's really what it is. It's really an education thing. I think about, 50 years from now, like I would love if, people just understood what Tourette's was, like the general public just understood and saw someone, maybe doing an eye blink or, someone with coprolalia and maybe just saying like, oh, okay, like they have Tourette's, or, kind of like acknowledging it as this thing that, a lot of us have. And that's the other thing that was interesting. When I was growing up, I didn't know the statistics, but I just assumed I was like the only one, I was in this, this place that, I was in a school where no one else at least openly had it. And it's interesting. And it's interesting too, like now I'll go into public and kind of, I'll be more aware of like, people, there are a lot of people who have tics, and I'll see someone on a bus, or I'll see someone and be like, oh, okay. Like more people have it than I think we realize. And
absolutely.
And it's just it's so interesting to kind of see that now that I'm an adult, and now that I'm aware of like, what these different tics look like and everything like that.
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, there were those expanded statistics that were released recently that, was it 1 in every 50 school age kid? I don't want to say it wrong, but it's more
Right.
people on the map than previously thought in terms of school age children who have Tourette syndrome. So and that ends up leading in a lot of cases to a lot of adults who have Tourette syndrome as well. You did mention earlier that, some doctors will tell you that it can clear up when it can, when I say clear up in quotes, but it can subside when you get older, but in your case, it hasn't. In my case, it hasn't. In a lot of cases with people who are on this podcast, it hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But does it still present you? I mean, the coming out tour, and having chances to interact with other people and to write about it and have that writing be for publication. I mean, those are really great, and I have to imagine really therapeutic things for you to do. Are there still challenges that remain with Tourette with you? I mean, does it interfere with your work, or that's I'd say depression, which is something I deal with, that does interfere with my work. Tourette, I'm not so sure if it does, except for the package deal of what can come with it.
Yeah, I think it does in a few ways. One thing that I found really interesting when I was working in an open office and, media companies in New York. And I felt that when I was in this open office, I was kind of on display, right? Like it was so much easier for people to notice my tics. Whereas, I think companies are getting better with accommodations and, if you need a private space to work from. But the open office really was tough for me. And that's like a very, it's funny, like people for a long time, the open office was this, new sexy thing where, you could be right next to your colleagues. And it was really difficult for me. So actually, in that regard, I think going remote when I actually got a new job in March 2020 and I went fully remote. That was nice because I felt like I could tic freely in a way that I didn't necessarily feel comfortable doing in the office. At the same time, I kind of noticed this interesting quirk in the video chat or the, these video platforms like Zoom, Google Meet, which is that if someone else is talking and I'm not on mute and I tic, it's going to show you. It's going to show me. So I learned pretty quickly to kind of put myself on mute when I'm not talking, to turn my camera off and maybe back on if I'm having a bit of a tic attack. So those things are all interesting. And, I think when it comes to work, I'm definitely not as open about my Tourette as maybe I am in other spheres. And I think part of that is me just, wanting to prove myself a little bit first, right? Like I started a job 6 months ago. And
I understand that.
Yeah. And I think, I wanted people to know me as, as a good, a good colleague, a good worker, and not just be like, oh, like we hired this person, she has Tourette, because I think that's, that's like probably what they would think of first.
The pace of judgment can outrun you sometimes when it comes to you showing and proving what your skills are.
And at the same time, I have these articles in my writing portfolio. Like if someone Googles me, they can probably find out that I have Tourette. So I think, and I'm okay with that. And I actually, I hadn't added these things to my portfolio until like a year ago. And, was kind of like, okay, if someone sees this and they don't want to hire me because of that, that's, first of all, that's definitely illegal. Second of all, that's not a company I want to work for. So, so I'm definitely, I'm opening up a little bit more. And I actually opened up to a colleague Friday, for the first time about having it. And, sure enough, she was really supportive, and, she also has a disability, and we sent each other kind of articles that we had written about our own experiences. That was really cool.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, I mean, that brings another question to mind. Is you mentioned being younger and thinking, I got to be the only person on earth with this. I mean, because it can feel so isolating in experience. Has your work and your research and your opening up about Tourette, have you gotten to actually communicate with other people who have Tourette syndrome at this point?
Yeah. So I actually applied to speak at the TAA's national conference last year, and I was accepted. So I spoke on a panel about disclosure.
The conference in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Nice.
It was great. I actually made it into a big road trip because I had never been anywhere in the Midwest besides Chicago. So I drove all the way from DC to Minneapolis and checked out a lot of cities on the way. It was
cool.
Really fun. Yeah, it was great. I mean,
it's a pretty city.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Minneapolis was so cool. One of the most bike friendly places I've ever seen. So, if you're a cyclist. Yeah, but it was the first time I had met anyone in person who had it. And it was actually my birthday. And I remember getting there and I was like, I'm just going to spend my birthday with a bunch of strangers. But I knew that, they were all connected to Tourette in some way. And, I was super excited about it. And I got there for like kind of the opening night, and it was, I mean, honestly, I guess the way to describe it was just like electric. Like, I honestly just felt like I was in this room of people I had never met before, but like I was automatically connected to them. I like just felt like so comfortable, like honestly more comfortable in a social setting than I ever had before.
Yeah. Isn't that cool how that works?
Cool. It was so cool. I also thought it was cool that there were so many kids there with their parents, because I mean, I was obviously so happy that like they got to meet other kids who had it. But then part of me was also like, oh man, like I wish I had something like that when I was younger. Like I think like, I just think that's so cool. Like, I think like at a time where you're, probably being bullied for your tics and you're struggling with, feeling isolated, like being like, oh, you know what? Like there are other kids who are going through this. Like that's, and having that space to do so. I think that's awesome. So it was honestly incredible. And, I think like every time someone tells me like, oh, I had this experience, it was so incredible. Like, people who study abroad, I feel like they always say that, but like, this was like truly like, there's no other way to describe it. It was just so amazing. And I just remember being like, this is the best birthday ever.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, that's important, I think, for parents to hear, because sometimes parents will write in and say, hey, there's a Tourette support group in my area, or there's a conference coming up or something like that. And, I've had thoughts about going and taking my son who has Tourette syndrome, but I'm worried it's going to make his tics worse. Is that a consideration? And I was like, yeah, that could be a consideration. Or, when I'm around people with Tourette, and a lot of people with Tourette say this, that, your tics just start popping off. And,
oh yeah.
And that's just kind of the way it goes. But the experience of being around other people, especially in a social setting, or say like you're in a hotel or you're at a restaurant or something, during one of the conference days or something. One of the first people I got to meet who had Tourette syndrome in my adult life was Craig, Tourette's cop. And we had a beer in Minneapolis. This was a few years ago. And it was great. There was a whole table of people with Tourette syndrome just doing nothing but, just like tics were flying left and right. And but it didn't feel wrong. It didn't feel, like there was some strength in numbers, I guess. But but overall, it just felt kind of right and just kind of natural to be at a table having a conversation where Tourette syndrome, even though we were talking about our lives with Tourette syndrome, because that was, we were at a conference. That's just kind of what was going on. It didn't have to be, it wasn't the necessary like, oh, hey, sorry, I have Tourette syndrome. It was just kind of just the ability to kind of just chill out and naturally with other people who already they got it. They have the receipts and they know what Tourette syndrome is like, and you don't have to go through all the, disclosure hoops and you
like
can just kind of feel like yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Because there is, even with people that are accepting, even with friends, when I'm meeting someone, sometimes I'll be like, oh yeah, I have Tourette's. Like, you have to kind of disclose that. And so, yeah, I felt the same exact way. It was just this like really incredible experience. And then also just talking to people about these such specific topics that really, only I can talk to other people with Tourette about. So like, I was talking to a few people who were in their 20s, and we were talking about dating with Tourette and what that's like, and like just such a specific part of life, right? But like sharing these stories and being like, oh, I've also experienced that. Like it was really great. And then of course, the panels and actually listening in on people speaking and talking about their own experience was really great as well.
Yeah, I think it can be mind-blowingly important to be able to see yourself reflected. And, especially if you have something where it can feel, even though we just talked about some statistic numbers earlier where, Tourette is a lot more common than, maybe we previously thought, but it's still a very isolating experience in terms of just, your everyday life. You don't go into work and clock in and talk to a whole bunch of other people who have Tourette syndrome. At least I don't.
Yeah.
And so, just having that opportunity, especially as a kid. I went to Tourette conferences when I was a kid, and I remember that it really changed my perspective, my sense of the world, and, who else, what did other people with Tourette syndrome look like? And I saw, I saw different kinds of expressions and cases, and I kind of wondered, is that going to happen to me? But at the same time, just the warmth that came off everybody there, because they knew that I knew that they knew. And that just, it was a level of acceptance I don't think I've ever felt anywhere else before.
Yeah. It sounds like we had very similar experiences, because I agree with everything you just said.
It's hard to believe that we're coming up on an hour of talking, and I want to make sure we didn't get away from something that you wanted to talk about, or if there's any questions that I didn't ask that you think are important to your story with Tourette syndrome. I have a feeling we could talk for 3 more hours if we wanted
to. No, I think we covered everything. I feel like we touched a lot of stuff. So yeah.
Well, where can people find maybe some of your writing about Tourette syndrome?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way for people to find really any of my writing is just my website. So taralerman.com, super easy, just my name.
TaraLerman.
Yes.
Taralerman.com. And I'll link to these things in the show notes as well with this episode for anybody who wants to check it out, because you've just to name a couple headlines that I saw. I like this one, why we need to change the conversation around Tourette syndrome. And it kind of goes through your life and kind of arrives at a conclusion about the narrative itself and kind of where it is and maybe where it needs to go and what that means for people, not just people with Tourette syndrome, but I think people on the outside as well when it comes to understanding, neurodiversity and not just for the sake of understanding neurodiversity. I mean, it becomes, it changes your consciousness when you learn about new things. And
totally.
Yeah, so I think you've done a really awesome job helping to educate.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Well, Tara, thank you so much. I really do appreciate your time. This has been a blast.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This has been great.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to our guest, Tara Lerman, taralerman.com. I'll have links in the show notes with this episode at tourettespodcast.com, and discussion group moderator Sophia always posts these links in the Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook. Take your reflections there. It's an awesome place to post questions in the discussion group. You can get answers, you can share thoughts about episodes, and whatever else you want to say with regard to Tourette syndrome. This has been episode 13 of season 8 of Tourette's Podcast. That means you can go to tourettespodcast.com and find years and years of episodes with Touretters all over the world. I love this. Tourette's Podcast is made possible by my friends at the Tourette Association of America, online at tourette.org, where you can find a provider, you can find answers to questions about Tourette, you can check out webinars coming up. There's a lot they do. And here's a little message from the Tourette Association. It says, each year end, we have the opportunity to reflect on where the days and months have taken us and what we hope to bring forth in the coming year. We celebrate our successes and our triumphs over failures, and we do so with the support of loved ones and community. As we close out our year, we celebrate the resilience of the TS and tic disorders community and the collective success we experienced in elevating awareness for a condition that affects each of us differently. For the last 50 years, the TAA has strived to be a place of hope and light during the darkest of times, a place you can turn to for the answers you need. And that's from the Tourette Association of America. And I'll post a link to TAA's fiscal 2022 annual report, in which the Tourette Association shares, reflects, and celebrates with you the progress that's been made. So you can check that out at tourette.org or tourettespodcast.com. I want to thank you so much for listening. We'll be back with another episode soon. This is Ben.